Greetings to everyone joining us tonight for our second event of the year and our second event as the Virginia Worker. This is, again, one of many events to come, and we hope you'll continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics covering the history of the Virginia working class and other relevant topics for Virginia workers. Our goal as the Virginia Worker team is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class, which otherwise does not exist. We are comprised of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which promote a class collaborationist agenda to the detriment of Virginia workers. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state affecting Virginia workers. We welcome all contributions from Virginia workers that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. So on to tonight's guests. We have Joe Burns. He's a veteran union negotiator and labor lawyer with over 25 years of experience negotiating labor agreements. He is currently the director of collective bargaining for the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA. He graduated from the New York University School of Law. Prior to law school, he worked in a public sector hospital and was president of his AFSCME local. He is author of Strike Back, Rediscovering Militant Tactics to Fight the Attacks on Public Employee Unions and Reviving the Strike, How Working People Can Regain Power and Transform America. Before we get into it, just wanted to lay out some ground rules here. Joe is going to present on his book tonight, Class Struggle Unionism. And then after the completion of his presentation, we'll open it up to a question and answer period where everybody who is joining us tonight can submit their questions directly into the chat box, and I'll read them off to Joe for him to respond to. So that's how it's going to go, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Joe here.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon in my case, since I'm out here in Hawaii. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about class struggle unionism, and I have a book with the same title coming out next week, and it really is sort of a, the book is the culmination of, sort of a lot of what I've been writing about over the last, couple of decade or so about unionism, starting with my book, Reviving the Strike, and then my book, Strike Back, about the public sector unionism. And all of those really, focused on the need to develop a more combative form of unionism, and one that was rooted in, workers, having power at the point of production, and particularly having the ability to wage strike activity, which historically was, the sort of core of unionism. In class struggle unionism, I dig a little bit deeper and, really go into the necessity for us to, develop and popularize a different form of unionism, which, I call class struggle unionism. And if you look at it for the first, 100 plus years of labor history in the United States, up until the, I'd say the mid 1980s, really the main competing sort of trends in unionism was between what was called business unionism and class struggle unionism. And the difference between the two is really, fundamental. It is, how do you look at the employment transaction? And for class struggle unionists, and we'll go a little bit deeper into this as we proceed, class struggle unionists look at it and they see that workers are forced to work for an employer, if not for that employer, for another employer. And out of that transaction is really how we get power and privilege, forming in society. It's how we get the billionaires and the super rich in society. And, I think class struggle unionism, and can be summed up with the slogan, labor creates all wealth. It's really based on the idea that, workers are the creator of wealth in society. And through the current organization of work, some of what they create is taken from them, or a good chunk of it, and that forms a different class in society. In contrast, the dominant form of unionism, historically has been what is called business unionism. And business unionists see their role as way, way more limited. They see their role as narrowly representing workers in a given plant or company or industry. And whereas the class struggle unionists say labor creates all wealth, the business unionists historically had a far more limited role, seeking a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. So they were seeking, sort of limited improvements within an unequal system, and not really trying to challenge that. And that's really, that sort of simple difference is really the at the core of a very different form of unionism. And both in terms of what I'm arguing, I'll talk about the elements about how they differ. But also, if you look back historically, historically, on the one hand, you had the sort of conservative craft unions in the American Federation of Labor, which was the main labor federation from the 1800s up until the 1950s. Then it joined up with the break-off CIO, formed the AFL-CIO, but predominantly both the AFL and the CIO at that point embraced more of the philosophy of business unionism rather than class struggle unionism. But on the other hand, we have a really rich history of class struggle unionism. We have both the we have the industrial workers of the world, which flourished as a competing labor federation in the early 1900s and being strong through the teens, and continuing from on there in a weaker form. We have the groups that were formed by the Communist Party in the 1920s, the Trade Union Educational League and Unity Leagues. We have the 1930s, sort of the various groups of class struggle unionists who led the Teamsters trucker strike in Minneapolis, the West Coast dock strikes, strikes all over the country, were heavily influenced by people who had this philosophy of class struggle unionism. And even following that, we had the creation of a sort of the civil rights unions that existed, the sort of left-led unions in the 40s and 50s, until business unionism sort of combined with the government to drive them out. And even beyond that, I think I got the tail end of it, but, when I entered the labor movement in the 1980s, I think we still had the tail end of the great experiment, where a lot of sort of activists from the 1960s who had become radicalized entered the labor movement, and really they formed rank and file caucuses. They denounced business unionism. They denounced labor bureaucrats and organized independent actions. And it was really a very particular form of unionism. And I think what I argue in my book and what I've pointed out, I think previously, is that from the mid-1980s on, they developed this whole different sort of form of unionism, which I say is neither fish nor fowl. It's like I call it labor liberalism in the book, but it's really the development of these sort of progressive unions that have a lot of features that are, some of them are like class struggle unionism because they think broader. They're against racism and sexism. They want to organize, at least in theory, the class. And they're for immigrants' rights. So they had a lot of good things, as opposed to the narrow business unionists of the AFL of the 1980s, who were, and I dealt with them, when I was starting out, were just absolutely horrible, and they're still around, some of them. But on the other hand, they really kind of spearheaded this abandonment of the workplace and the key features, which I'll talk about class struggle unionism. And I think this, so labor liberalism, when you think about SEIU and the fight for 15 and some of the efforts of the, sort of alt unionism, which are good because they're thinking differently, but they've also kind of led us away from the sort of bread and butter of, of workplace struggle and worker-led struggle. So let me just go through some of the key features of class struggle unionism. I think that'll, sort of help the discussion. And, obviously one of the key components of class struggle unionism is because class struggle unionists looked at the employment transaction in a certain way, they viewed it that workers in this society are forced to go to work. And they may not, if you don't work for one employer, you're going to work for another. But as a result of your labor, and this is one thing all, the workers have in common, whether you work at Starbucks or Target, or you work at the Ford plant or whatever, as a result of your labor, value is created. Your labor provides something to the workplace enterprise that makes the outcome more valuable than it would have been if you hadn't been hired. And that, in fact, is the very reason you're hired. And as a result of that, at the end of the workday, you might have produced, $800 or, $150 worth of value. But at the end of the day, your wages may be, $60 or whatever it is, whatever your wage rate is, or it could even be $100 or whatever it is. But that money, that value that you create in your workplace, it flows up and up all across in thousands and thousands of transactions across society. And the end result of that is how we get billionaires in society. It's not because people are just greedy or corporate greed. It's the result of a system. So class struggle unionists historically have looked at the transaction and have looked at that as the formation of a different classes, the working class and the employing class. And because of that, and because they view it as coming out of the workplace, it really creates a form of unionism, which is, both sees the need for being worker-led, based in the workplace, but also represent the entire working class. So I just want to go through a couple of the differences that we have between class struggle unionism. So one of the features of class struggle unionism, I think the United Electrical Workers, I've captured this in a pamphlet a couple years ago, and it comes from a famous book from the 1950s, but it's them and us. It's this idea that on every issue, the employing class and the working class have different interests. And when it comes to unionism, it means that that our interests are not allied. But when you go in the labor movement, a lot of the leadership of the existing labor movement, the business unionists today. So if you look at the building trades, they see a big part of their survival in negotiating agreements where they can provide and show value to other employers. They basically get together with the boss and show that they are going to keep wages or provide, skilled workers at a certain level. And that's really their path forward, rather than seeing that, they actually have very different interests. And I think we saw that most recently in the strike in Washington state of the carpenters, where, a rank and file group who very much had a class struggle union perspective ended up leading, voting down, leading the vote against the vote in 4 contracts. They finally did a half-hearted strike, and then the business unionists, who didn't want to disrupt their relationship with the employers, ended up, narrowly getting agreement passed. But it turns out that they had even gone so far as to rig the vote. So the sort of conflict between the business unionists, who don't want conflict with the employers, who want to kind of tamp things down, who want to contain the struggle, and the class struggle unionists who are trying to, basically seeing conflict in every situation, trying to engage in conflict because they know that that's the way that we make the gains. The other core sort of component of class struggle unionism in terms of class struggle union ideas is this idea that the working class must emancipate itself, meaning that the working class has to lead the working class struggles. And this is a very important point, and it kind of runs through a lot of the, if you look back historically about how the internal functionings of the more left unions, what you would find is that they're very democratic. They fight for worker control in the shop floor, for democratic constitutions and so forth. They lead a lot of the reform movements. So if you see the originations of the Teamsters for Democratic Union, the reformers in the UAW historically have come out of the class struggle union trend. And that's really kind of fundamental. When I think of like the class struggle unionists that I've known for decades, kind of doing union work, that's a core feature. And it really differs from a lot of these, sort of progressive in name unionists who I call labor liberals, who really kind of adopt the language of the left social movements and so forth, but really have gone further and further away from the workforce. So you get SEIU, who were really big in the 90s and really were playing a role that they were leading the labor movement using a lot of progressive, sort of social movement terms. But on the other hand, consolidating locals into these, giant locals of janitors that stretch up and down the East Coast, that there's no possible way that, the rank and file could control because it's so staff driven. So that's another feature that's, fundamentally different. The other key difference, and I think this is, we were talking about it before the program started a bit, is that the class struggle unionists, at the core, understood the importance of the fight for the shop floor or the workplace floor or whatever sort of workspace that folks had. They viewed that as as an essential component of unionism, and for very good reason. And I've been a negotiator. All I've been doing for decades is negotiating labor contracts. And the easier stuff to resolve is what the pay rates, what the wages are going to be. But where we really get into a lot of conflict is control of the workplace and control of the work shifts and control of how hard workers are going to have to work. Those issues really go to the core of the relationship, because I think that management understands that they can if they can make workers work longer or harder or get more shifts in a plant in the day or go to 10-hour shifts or make people do weekend work, they can double the rate of exploitation. So they don't have to fight over a 5% increase when they can do that. And indeed, if you look at the recent strike wave, a lot of the issues that the workers had when they were really leading the rebellion from below in a lot of these unions and voting down the tentative agreements. And if you see what their sort of goals and aspirations were, they were about, the stagehands, Yahtzee, looking to, who's going to control the streaming revenue. It was really kind of these ambitious ideas. It was about, for them, controlling the work schedule and how much rest they got. There was, the UAW folks, looking to eliminate the two-tier to get everyone on the same playing field. A lot of the contract disputes were about, weekend work or overtime or things like that. And all of those are very, a lot more difficult. And you saw as the strikes go on, a lot of the actual negotiators at the table kind of shifted the debate about what they were talking about. And at the end of the day, a lot of settlements sort of dropped those sort of core issues or only marginally dealt with them and dealt with the lot easier issues to deal with, which were, what were the wages. And so anyway, so this fight for the shop floor is really a key component of class struggle unionism. The final, sort of piece of it that I'll talk about in this context is that, class struggle unionists, because they view this employment transaction as inherently unequal, it also leads to a different view of the government and the press and the powers that be in society, because you come to realize that the entire system is set up to, sort of facilitate this employment transaction. The employers call it profit, we call it theft. So basically the whole system is set up to facilitate a class of people making money off of workers. And for that reason, I think class struggle unionists historically have been very skeptical about the role of the government and the government as a protector. So if you go back to the, sort of early labor disputes with the industrial workers of the world, or the sort of longshore workers on the West Coast, or the Teamsters truckers, they were very suspicious, because when they engaged in this sort of militant struggle, the government would come in to try and repress them. But if that didn't work, then they would send in the federal mediators, and they would try and sweet talk people into doing deals that weren't necessarily in the best interest of the workers. A lot of the business unionists, from the international unionists, would come in and try and tamp down the struggle, and the class struggle unionists had to confront that. And I think you really see that carrying over today, because you really see that there's this whole trend within trade unionism, which, while they talk about using strikes and so forth, so we talk about the Fight for 15, or, some of those types of actions. And, to their credit, they're supporting strikes. But these strikes aren't really, strikes to stop production, or really to, take on the employer at the workplace. They're really to get the government to step in and raise the minimum wage up to $15, or to institute labor standards. And, it's really based on this idea that the government's going to step in and sort of save stuff from the working class. So I think, once we get from there, we could go into, there's a whole host of other differences between sort of class struggle unionists and the business unionists. Obviously, class struggle unionists believe that, workers in the world have, more in common than they do with the employers. So historically have fought for internationalism, fought against U.S., sort of imperial demands abroad and wars. When I started in the 1980s, a lot of us were working on opposing the role of the American Federation of AFL-CIO in supporting repressive governments abroad, and particularly in Central America. We stand for immigrants' rights. I think labor politics, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but they're all sort of tied in to these basic ideas. So I just want to talk about a few other pieces, and then maybe we can have a discussion. And my previous books, I guess what I'll back up and say, I don't think we can have a sort of class struggle union movement if we can't figure out how to develop class struggle tactics. And what that means is we need to have an effective labor movement which has the ability to confront capital from a position of power. in my first book, or my first couple books, but particularly Reviving the Strike, I argued that the move away from the strike action that was prevalent in the 1980s towards, these sort of, corporate campaigns and, organizing the unorganized, but not based on power, the sort of alt unionism, social unionism, all these other attempts, we're avoiding the fundamental question, which is we need a strong labor movement based on class struggle tactics, which means that we understand that we can't just simply go out on strike and put up picket lines, because in the context of national labor markets, employers can replace, and they do replace workers. And they always have that threat, even here in a tighter labor market. And historically, class struggle unionists advanced a set of tactics, which were, and we really were kind of playing around, or not playing around, but we were kind of pushing these in the 1980s about how do you blockade plants? How do you stop, how do you, stop scabs from coming in the plant? What are the secondary boycott tactics which have been outlawed? So I have a whole chapter in the book kind of discussing that, about how can we start to kind of revive the discussion about how do we bring those tactics back. Now, it's easy to say we should do all this, but I think at its core, to revive class struggle tactics, we need to sort of break with the set of ideas that business unionists and the Democratic Party have foisted upon us for decades. That means thinking about these tactics in a different way, about our right to impinge on property rights, and to go back to the sort of philosophy that was prevalent, not just through the 1930s, but I would say even amongst widespread within the labor movement up until the 1970s. I think the other thing, and I have a whole chapter on this about class struggle organizing. I think for the last, 15, 20 years, a lot of left progressive labor theory has really been spent on how do we organize workers? And it's really been spent on what are organizing techniques? How do we organize, these schools that people put on? But that's really different than, when I kind of, started out in the labor movement. If you thought, well, what are sort of progressive or left wing or class struggle unionists thinking about the role of us as organizers? I don't think I ever went in and said, oh, I'm going in to organize workers. I thought I was going in to join a movement, to learn from people, to learn from the workers, to learn from, sort of the fighting trade unionists who were out there, and really saw our role as, sort of putting together a pole within the labor movement, sort of fighting a fighting pole within the labor movement and pulling people. That's why in the 1970s, you'll see a lot of the sort of folks who went in with the class struggle union perspective, these thousands and thousands of radicalized, anti-war and civil rights movement activists. They went in there and they formed caucuses because they realized that they had a different ideological or a different set of ideas from the sort of business unionists who were running the locals or the internationals, and they tried to set up, these, sort of caucuses or labor notes or Teamsters for Democratic Union or the UAW, all these different reform movements. The commercial workers had them too, and they set these up as, sort of different sort of projects within the labor movement. So they were organizing, but they didn't see themselves and their role as simply like we're just learning how to map out a workplace, or we're learning these set of techniques. Like that was really going to solve the problem. I think they understood that the fundamentals of our difference, with the labor movement is, with sort of a bureaucratic wing of the labor movement, is ideological, is that we have a different set of ideas and we have a different set of interests that we're promoting from them. And that really, sort of leads to a sort of a different sort of view. I think in recent years, there's been talk about this concept of the militant minority, and people are sort of looking back, which is a good thing. And they're trying to revive sort of ideas that were prevalent, maybe in the 1920s or ones that were picked up in the 1970s and so forth. And there's been different takes on it, the rank and file strategy, a lot of stuff. I'm throwing out a few terms, but these are just kind of debates that have been out there that folks may be familiar with. And I'll just say that, in my reading of history and in my perspective, the sort of core of all of these ideas, the militant minority, if you look at it historically, the militant minority is this idea that there's a group of fighting workers that you're going to pull together, and they're really kind of the engine of pushing things forward. And in that sense, it's true, it's correct as an organizing technique. But I think it also goes a bit deeper, because it's really, it's not just a way of organizing workers. It's sort of a set of demands that get placed on the entire labor movement, because our goal is not just to organize one little shop, and we can't do that ourselves. But I think historically, class struggle unionists put forward these bold demands for the entire labor movement and tried to reshape how they did it. So if you look at the push for industrial unionism, or a labor movement that included all workers, that was not just the industrial workers of the world doing that. At every AFL convention between the early 1900s and the split in 35 or so, in every convention, they debated it out and got a substantial number of developments saying that we need to organize all workers. So that's the sort of organizing approach, is not just like that we can do it ourselves, but we're also building a pole in the labor movement that says we can do more. And obviously, these sort of attempts to build alternate models are important, because it shows a different way. But it's also, we need to do a lot more about demanding a different way of doing it for the labor movement. And that's really, I think I think just kind of in winding down my comments, and hope we can have some discussion. But I've been, I think I started, my first involvement in the labor movement was back during the Hermel strike in the 85, 86. I think people who've been around a while, may recall that, or folks may have read about it. I know you guys had Peter Ratchliff on last week in your program, professor from McAllister. That's how I met Peter. He was the head of the P9 support committee in Minnesota. But that was really, when I think back of, a sort of a basic divide in the labor movement between class struggle unionists who all across the country rallied around these P9 strikers who were fighting both their international and the press and the National Guard and their employer, expanding the picket line. They were in a very sharp struggle, and it really forced everyone in the labor movement to pick sides. But I think I guess what I'm, my overall message is, I've seen a lot of different theories of labor come and go over the last 20, 30 years. Everyone has an idea, alt unionism. There's these ideas of, social unionism. There's the organizing approach. There's, there's been all these different iterations of like how we're going to revive the labor movement. But I guess what I'm putting out is, and it may take a long time to do this, but if we can't go back to basics and develop a class struggle labor movement that's based on this idea that the employing class and the working class have nothing in common, and that the only way we're going to get out of this is to fight our way out of it, that is the key to reviving the labor movement. And I think part of having discussions like this and, sort of spreading these ideas is a key component of doing that. So anyway, that concludes my talk, and maybe we can have some discussion.
Great. Thanks for giving us that overview of your argument and book. I'm sure folks will be eager to go out and buy it and read the full argument. I like the table of contents listed and really want to dig in more on this stuff, but it's definitely relevant to, I think, our experiences. We do have several questions already in the chat here, and I'll just start in a chronological order here. Mark asked, what do you think about applying class struggle unionism to the rank and file strategy in general? And what do you think about Kim Moody's interpretation of the strategy specifically?
That's a very good question, because I've actually just been kind of thinking about it because I started to write something up on that. So for folks who don't know, back in 2001, Kim Moody, who was, I think it was 2001, 2003, that period. Kim Moody, who was, longtime class struggle unionist, who was one of the founders of Labor Notes. He's written a number of excellent books on labor. Wrote an article called The Rank and File Strategy. And I think recently that's, the Democratic Socialists of America, at their convention, a lot of folks have kind of embraced that as a framework of strategy. So I've been kind of thinking about that because it's a, sort of a popular sort of view out there among class struggle unionists. And when you read the full title of it, of the rank and file strategy, what you'll see is I'd have to pull up the exact words, but it's on how to build the socialist movement in the United States. So I think that kind of shapes my view of it and how it fits within class struggle unionism. Moody's work is really about, as a weak sort of socialist movement, unconnected and socialist, meaning folks who want to change this sort of, they have, sort of a broader set of objectives of changing the relationship that I talked about between the workers being exploited and the sort of billionaires or the those who are receiving and taking the money from the workers. But those who want to build this sort of socialist movement have a problem in that they're, generally we're disconnected from the working class. And Moody wrote this book, article, which was influential, saying, look, we need to orient towards working class struggles, but we can't just orient towards any working class struggles because the labor unions are so bureaucratic and they contain the struggle. So we need to, sort of be there at the grassroots, and that needs to form the core of our activity if we really want to build a socialist movement in the United States. So that's just a very brief, sort of overview of my view of that. And I think that's all true, but I think because of that, because his sort of argument and approach starts there, it leaves out a lot of the other questions of class struggle unionism. So I would view it, and he may or may not agree, but I would view that class struggle unionism is sort of the overall philosophy that is sort of coming from a trade union point of view. And it can be socialists doing it, or it can be others, but it's basically all those who believe that the sort of the employment transaction is somehow inherently unfair or exploitative. And I think it's an overall philosophy, and I think the rank and file strategy is kind of a piece of that. I'll just say one more word on that. I think there's been, because of the wording of it, I think there's been a lot of confusion about what it is and what it means. I think a lot of people think it means like, going in and industrializing, which is a term that, folks use now. They call it salting, but going and getting a job in the workplace. And I think his actual arguments are a little bit different. But I do have a sort of discussion of that a little bit in the organizing chapter of the book as well.
Thanks. George wanted to know, they said they could see what you were saying about private sector labor leading to billionaires, but they were curious how you thought public sector labor gets extracted to create a billionaire class, is how they worded it.
Yeah, I think that millions of workers work for various public employers, and currently half of the labor movement, approximately, the organized part of the labor movement, AFL-CIO and so forth, and other unions, are public workers. So and if you look at some of the sort of key battles of recent years, until this sort of mini strike wave of industrial workers, a lot of it was coming out of the public sector, right? We had the red state teachers revolts, we had the Chicago teachers, we've had a lot of sort of militancy coming out of the public sector. In terms of the question of exploitation, one of the things that, okay, wait, I gotta get, wait, oh. Here, just give me a second. I think my battery's running out.
I just want to let everybody know that asking questions, we're keeping them logged here, and we'll ask them in chronological order as they come. Good questions, though. Keep them coming. Just keep sending them in the chat.
Are you fucking kidding me? All right. You guys still there?
Oh, yeah, we're here.
Sorry, it said like 3 hours left on my battery, and then it went to 2%, and then I couldn't find my cord. So, all right, let's, where were we? What were we talking about?
Here, let me pull the question up again here.
Postal.
They were asking about the difference between private sector and public sector that I believe George was saying they recognized, how the private sector labor leads to creating billionaires, but how does public sector labor get extracted to create a billionaire class?
So what the billionaires want to do is they want to control as much of the wealth in society that they can. But one of the things they need to do is they need to, in order to run their businesses, there needs to be an infrastructure in society. They need roads. They need roads to be plowed. They need education. They need all of these things. They need, if they're based in a nation state, they need a military and so forth. They need government to regulate. So they need all of these things in order to sort of extract value from workers. They don't really like it. And they also need to, have some sort of programs so that the working class can reproduce itself. So they need to be some sort of programs for children and something to deal with the fact when people get older and they can no longer exploit them. What do they do for the rest of their lives? And some of the items in the public sector have been won by unions. Obviously, so the basic conflict that plays out in the private public sector is really twofold. One is the businesses and using their influence in government, they try and drive down the cost of the sort of social wage as low as they can. And that creates an inherent conflict because public workers want to get paid better, but public workers are also at the core fighting for the entire working class because they're fighting for public programs. They're fighting for things that we need. That creates a sort of explosive conflict, and the struggle of public sector workers is very much a part of the class struggle for those reasons.
Great. Mark had another good question here. They wanted to know, what do you think about the efforts to organize Amazon, specifically the different models with like Amazonians United versus Amazon Labor Union versus BAMazon with RWDBSU. They said there seems to be a stark contrast in the successes of the unions using the NLRB and the attempts at solidarity unionism. What's your take?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. So in the election down in Bessemer, Alabama, that happened, I guess that was last year, it spawned a whole sort of mini industry of opinion pieces in the labor movement and even in the liberal press. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of articles about the issue. But I think very little attention was placed on the fact, and all these people writing about like the different organizing techniques and this Jane McAvee about whether or not they did the right organizing techniques and all this stuff, but none of them really focused, or very few focused on the fundamental question of that when you read a lot of the comments of the workers down there, a lot of them had been in other unions and so forth and didn't, some had okay experiences, some didn't. But there was no evidence whatsoever that that union at that plant could raise wages significantly or deal with the workers' concerns. It really goes to the fact that, for about 30 years, we have been trying to entice workers to join a weak and declining labor movement. That and workers have said it again and again, they don't want to join a weak labor movement. But what we have seen over the course of history is when we have a powerful labor movement that's on the move, workers flock to it. Public employees spent decades trying to organize workers and build these weak little unions, and they were begging employers. But in the 1960s, they launched one of the great strike waves in US history, and organized millions and millions of workers, and went from, the low numbers, under 10% density, way low, below 10, and went up to 40 plus percent public workers organized by the 1970s. And it was, thousands of strikes happening during that period. So the point is, this idea that they're going to, win these elections and that's what's going to revive the labor movement, maybe it fits in as a tactic because then you can kind of push things forward. But if you're not based on an idea that you're building struggle, and then it's going to go nowhere, because we know it. We've done it. SEIU spent, and this is not an overestimation, this is based on the numbers, I have it in Reviving the Strike, they spent $1 billion on organizing from 95 up until, the 2008 or 9. And they didn't even budge density in their core industries. So I think we've already been through it. We know that route's not going to work. I'm a lot more interested in, sort of the Amazonians United and the sort of folks who are, building the struggle, on the shop floor and the experimentation. And, sort of the IWW Jimmy Johns, even though they didn't win the elections, that's currently being won at Starbucks. I think they were exploring some different tactics and leafleting and taking on the employer. And I think that ultimately is going to be a lot more fruitful than this idea that we're just going to start winning elections after 30 years of experience, where it's really not going to change things.
Agreed. Mike asks that you mentioned the Democrats briefly. How damaging has the relationship between business unions and the Democrats been, and how important is it for the labor movement to distance itself from the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I mean, look, every election cycle, the Democrats, the labor movement spends hundreds of millions of dollars and basically all of these resources in trying to elect Democrats. And then following the election, I mean, this time it happened again. I've just been through this, we've been through this for decades, right? So Biden makes all these promises, he gets in. There's all this little flurry of discussion about we need to pass the PRO Act. A lot of, sort of progressive labor outlets are talking about it. And then what happens? Just kind of dies away because it's not going to happen. And even if it did happen, it would be, sort of gutted by the courts anyway. But, all that's a problem and a waste of time. But I think the bigger problem is that the sort of ties of the labor movement and ties of the sort of nonprofit industrial complex, these sort of nonprofits who are tied to the Democratic Party but are working on labors, including some of the worker centers, or probably many of them, who are really oriented towards the Democrat, is I think it's based on it brings a set of employers' ideas into the labor movement, because fundamentally the Democratic Party is primarily funded and represents the interests of the employing class, not the working class. And they'll talk a little bit nicer and make a little bit, trying to accommodate and pull in the labor movement. But at the end of the idea, it's a set of ideas. And if you go to a lot of these national unions, most of them are based in DC, and most of them, really, are their idea of the labor movement doing well, for a lot of them, is under Trump, they didn't get invited to the White House. They didn't get invited to these councils. They didn't get to participate in these study groups and stuff. And now they are. So, life looks a lot better, even though the conditions for the working class, are not really changing for the better. So part of class struggle unionism is breaking from the Democratic Party. But I may differ from some other leftists who say we need to form a labor party. I support the Labor Party. I supported Labor Party advocates in the 90s, but until we build the sort of class struggle labor movement, that's really the basis for having a Labor Party.
I answered one of my questions about your thoughts on a workers' party. But I'll get to the next question here from Jay. He was wondering, how do you think we combat business unionism while most workers are completely unorganized and as such may just try to join a union as opposed to organize the shop floor independently or at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of it is, I think we need to think about our labor work in a way that sort of builds and puts demands broader and build a trend within the labor movement. So right now, there really isn't there really hasn't been a poll of class struggle unionism to basically stand up. So I think particularly, let me just back up a second. I think we need, Oh, wait, hey, can you ask a question again? I'm kind of.
Yeah, Jay was wondering, how do you think we combat business unionism while most workers are completely unorganized and as such may just try to join a union, like a business union, as opposed to organize the shop floor independently or even bother organizing at all?
Okay. Here's a quicker answer. Look, I think we need to focus on building struggle and building independence wherever we do it. So, and supporting worker-led struggle. So this really comes up lately. You know, this whole term of salting. So there's a lot of folks who went into the labor movement in recent years. It might be a college student, and they go and salt for like a union like Unite Here, or for some other union, but they're going in there kind of under the control of the union staff. But then if the union staff decide they're going to pull the plug, and I've talked to a number of folks who have done this, and maybe you have too, the union staff decide that they're going to pull the campaign or make the decision, and they're left there with the workers that they've been trying to organize, and they haven't built any sort of independent power. So I think a lot better approach for folks who want to do labor movement is to go establish these independent groups, because I think you can do a lot more. Like if you're in the UAW participating in the reform group, one or two people who are pretty, good organizers and understand things can do a lot. Look at the carpenters, sort of work that they did in the Northwest, or in, this big fight at Hunts Point. A lot of people were able to do a lot. The Chicago teachers, a lot of people with the class struggle perspective went in there, not to just work for the union, as sort of staff organizers, but they were teachers, and they got together and they formed a different a different set of ideas, and the Chicago Teachers Union, and really sparked a nationwide rebellion. And the core of that was breaking with the neoliberal Democrats. The Democratic Party and the Teachers Union had really been tied in with them for the last couple decades. So I think that's how we do it.
Yeah, I know for me personally, trying to organize at a place that in an industry that isn't very well organized at all and is seen as not worthy of organizing in retail, a lot of workers don't even have a conception of class struggle. I think if you try to approach them with that idea, they would think you were weird. And so it's, it feels like trying to combat the corporate ideology they put out there, which workers only kind of halfway believe, but it sounds like they're even less interested in the idea of class struggle. So I don't know if you have any advice on overcoming that or what.
Here's where, maybe I disagree with the organizing model that's been in place for kind of years, is that, class conflicts inherent in the workplace. So we don't need to bring sort of class struggle or even class consciousness to the workplace. What we need to do is, go there into the workplace and help workers fight. And, maybe this is a big difference I have, maybe because I'm a bargainer, but there's been no area, like we continually get like 99% strike votes and stuff. So it's not because workers don't want to fight. They actually want to fight in union, or even if there's not a union, if you pick the right issues, people are going to want to fight. And I don't think they have to be, I don't think they can or should, go in there and preach about class struggle. But, our goal and our task is really, to help workers and to wherever we are, to, wage more effectively the struggle. And I think just finally on this, people have written like tons and tons of articles about how to organize and this and that. But look at the strike wave of the sort of industrial workers that happened. A lot of those they didn't happen because someone went in there and talked to every worker about, what your differences or your philosophy. These strikes happened because the Volvo workers voted down tentative agreements, or the carpenters voted down tentative agreements, or the workers were pissed off and they organized themselves. and the sort of help that they needed. They pulled together the picket lines and stuff like that. But I think, sort of navigating and deepening the struggle and expanding it is really, where I think we can play a key role.
Jay had a good point here. They're in Roanoke, and they said that they work for a Head Start preschool, and they formed an independent workers committee to fight for improved conditions, as opposed to, say, that Starbucks Workers United, who've gone through Workers United, SEIU, and they've had a majority of workers, 21 out of 26, who signed the authorization cards. But he's trying to figure out how to continue to stick together with their independent workers committee and fight through the fears and against union busting or being co-opted for their goals. And it's just been difficult for them being independent.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that come up a lot, right? If you see some of the IWW sort of attempts in various shops is how do you keep it going, or if you build this form of workplace organization, especially if it's based on some sort of strong organizers in there. And I think that's why a lot of groups eventually do go and call for an election, because that formalizes the sort of bargaining relationship and sort of cements the gains. I'm not one who I'm not against going to elections. I think they can be an important part of the struggle. I think it's just a problem when they're the only piece of it, and when you go in there and it should be part of an overall plan to kind of push things forward.
Right. Ken here is asking, have you run into any organizers out there who recognize that we will increasingly have a very powerful ally working on our side? They're talking about the climate crisis, which will be taking more and more of its vengeance, as things unfold with the destruction of nature. In short, bolstering workers in the class struggle as a result of natural catastrophes that neoliberal capitalism simply isn't prepared for. So that was their question and point comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, I think Michael Yates in his book, what's his book? I cite it a lot, but he's a labor economist, longtime sort of labor educator and activist. And he talks about the different ways that, the sort of billionaires can increase their profit. And one of those is their relationship with the environment, both in terms of off-shifting costs, in terms of pollution onto everybody else, or taking natural resources. So I think it's a key component. I think there is a lot of sort of liberal ideas about how to approach it, and I think, I think that's about it.
Yeah, I was curious about, you emphasize internationalism and class struggle unionism, like that being a part of class struggle unionism. And, with things unfolding right now with Ukraine, we put out a statement through our local chapter about our role as U.S. workers and how, our primary enemy is here at home. It's the employing class. It's not some foreign enemy, right? And trying to like broach that subject and talk to workers and about it and get them to sign on with it. It seems, again, similar to the idea of like trying to encourage class struggle as a concept, just even trying to encourage the idea that workers should even have an opinion on international affairs, or that we can influence it in any way, right? It just feels like there's a general default sense of like being nihilistic towards things as workers, in my experience here in the South and unorganized workplaces. So I don't know if you had any thoughts or comments about that, like internationalism in our current context with the situation in the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, my general thing is I've found is that you know the workers I've dealt with, they they deal with things that they think matter or whatever. They come forward when it's matter, and I don't think people feel much control over sort of policy towards Ukraine or the Russian invasion. So I think it's hard to sort of tie folks in. I know back in the 90s, the Ford workers in Minnesota, spent a lot of time, developing ties, directly between their plant and workers in Mexico, and were able to, sort of build on those ties to kind of, bring it into labor policy and so forth. But, I think, yeah, so I think some of this stuff is, what are you going to be able to do in a particular workplace? And then, the other question is what is your overall approach, as we as a labor movement gain more power and so forth, class struggle wing, then we confront these, how do we relate to workers in other world, around the world. And, I think we need to be consistent, sort of anti-imperialist or anti-empire, and not just go along and support the war machine because the drums start beating, because they certainly do.
Tony asked, well, they're saying that they had worked in a unionized job where the union didn't even do the most basic things, such as filing labor charges for labor violations. Often simple things like this would not be done after higher ups opposed doing so in the name of tactics, quote unquote, and good relations, quote unquote. Any suggestions on overcoming the union bureaucracy?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a key, a key part of what we have to do. I mean, but a lot of that sort of, if you read a lot of the labor theory of the last couple of decades, they don't really emphasize like just how screwed up most of the labor movement is. I mean, there's hardly any union that I would want to work for. A lot of those are very bureaucratic. You have a whole stratum of people whose jobs and their sort of being, fighting employers means more work for them. And it means, and militant strikes means that they could lose their jobs and their union pensions and so forth. So there's really kind of a fundamental, sort of disconnect or difference of interests. And I think as, folks who are in a shop, I think you often have to, you have to contend with the bureaucrats because they hold the power and they often control the relationship with the employers. So I think, and Kim Moody talks about this in the rank and file strategy, quoting Farrell Dobbs from the Teamsters Truckers strikes, the more, if you build a base and build the struggle, then you're basically going to catch the bureaucrats in the crossfire, because they're going to have to start doing stuff because the workers, at the end of the day, I always tell people, believe in the workers you're working with. And if if you sort of get them organized, then that's, you're going to have to contend with, that's going to, help force the higher ups in the union to do stuff, but because you can't rely on them to do it themselves.
Great. I have this question from Sarah. She asks, how do we best pursue strategic industry organizing, productive sectors versus unproductive ones? Where should we focus and how?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the bigger picture, I clearly, I think too little emphasis has been given to sort of manufacturing and basic industry in recent years. A lot of folks have sort of written that off, and in part because it's sort of been easier to organize in some of these sectors. I think that's the sort of bigger question about if we had sort of a lot of resources and stuff. I think in the immediate run, I think people, we're so weak all over the place that any individual can make, differences wherever you are, and some of the experience in the retail sector is good. But I also think if we had more sort of conscious folks in these sort of, auto and these other sectors, that there's a bang for the buck in terms of, ability to really take on capital, that I think has been underlooked.
Great, much appreciated. We'll ask, well, let's see, we got a question here from, let me find it. Apologies. Yeah, from George. He was wondering, how did old school labor organizations like the AFL-CIO, IWW, et cetera, think about immigration, nativism, et cetera?
So, so way back, the American Federation of Labor, was horrible on the question of immigrant workers. When you look at the union label, the old thing about for the union label, a lot of that, sort of developed in the 1890s against Asian workers, and so I think there's a sort of long history in the AFL of anti-immigrant sentiments and actions, and that continued. Back when I was starting up in the 1980s, the AFL-CIO at the time had horrible positions on immigration, and that was in line with a lot of unions. The United Farm Workers, there's a whole thing where they would go around and try and beat up immigrant workers, and that is a sort of fundamental difference between the class struggle unionist approach, which sees immigrant workers aren't the problem, obviously. But I think the industrial workers of the world, there's probably some counter examples, but in general, had a more welcoming approach in line with their philosophy. And certainly that was sort of core to the successes of the 1930s, was pulling together all workers, which really helped build the CIO and the industrial workers. The AFL at the time, they just looked down on foreign-born workers, which, who formed a good proportion of the emerging, sort of industrial economy.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about the need to buck labor law at a certain point, and like the success of the labor movement really hinging on that, and not being stuck, just abiding by the law and injunctions and all that. I guess my question is like, how do you see that in relation to, like, say, general strikes, like the strike wave in the 30s, where you saw like 4 massive general strikes essentially the year before the NLRB is passed, and like legalizing the right to organize and striking. Is that what you're sort of thinking along those lines in terms of rebuilding the class struggle unionism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of romanticism in recent years about the general strike, and it's like some silver bullet, which is gonna, we're gonna take a completely weak labor movement, and if we just put out enough calls for a general strike, it'll happen. I think the reality is general strikes have tended to be more of an extension of solidarity. It's been, you have a sort of militant labor movement kind of bucking up and fighting. A group of workers get in a fight, they put out a call for other workers to come support them, the employer counterattacks, and then more and more workers get drawn to the struggle. And that's the historic formula. And I think it's true. It's not just the 1930s. I think when we look at the public employee strike wave of the 70s, we have, Baltimore, you got one group of workers going out, the sanitation workers, then pretty soon all the city workers are out. Philadelphia, they arrest all the teachers. The labor movement gets together and decides they're going to call for a general strike in the city. So those are really extensions. I think in my book, when I talk about how do we rebuild class struggle tactics, I think in every struggle that I see, there's usually a point where you decide, are you going to expand the struggle or are you going to back down when the employer escalates? We have the strength as a labor movement that there's more of us, so we can pull in more and more workers. And when we did that in the 1930s, that's when we, you'd engage in these battles outside the plants because more workers would get called in. I think more recently, if you look at the Red State Revolt, where the teachers were able to strike in states like, West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma, and so forth, what we find is that they were able to do that because they all struck at the same time. And actually, by doing that tactic, they were a lot more protected than if they had to strike one particular school district where they would have been crushed. So, the general rule is, try and expand the struggle. And certainly I could give you a lot of examples where that didn't happen in the 1980s, including struggles I supported, the paper workers, the P9 strike, which I talked about before, all of which, what the capitalists have done as an employing class is they've constructed a system where, workers are forced to strike at one plant. In 1959, 500,000 steelworkers struck the entire, steel production in the country. They didn't strike one plant at a time. So expanding the dispute is normally how we do it. And that may or may not lead to a general strike, but it'll lead to broader conflict.
Yeah, that was one of the points Peter made with his presentation, is that in some ways the labor law now is less favorable than when, say, the Knights of Labor were organizing in the late 1800s. They didn't have the Taft-Hartley law in effect, banning secondary strikes and boycotts and things like that.
Yeah, it's too much work, but I was going to write a law review article where I started on it, but I actually looked back. Was labor law as it exists today worse or better than the state of the law in the 1920s? And what you'll find is that, back then, a lot of the laws, they didn't like enjoin you from doing these sort of industry-wide strikes in certain states, and today, if you were in a unionized context, you'd be brought up on unfair labor practice charges if you went broader. There's a lot more sanctions put on unions, which is one of the biggest powers they have, is tens of millions of dollars in fines that they can impose on the unions, with these big bureaucracies and buildings, is a lot of power. So yeah, I think, the sort of unregulated situation, had its benefits as well as its weaknesses, but in general, for those who wanted a sort of fighting labor movement, it provided better terrain.
Well, we've had you here for almost an hour and a half now. I don't want to keep you going. And I think we exhausted all the questions. So just wanted to thank you and thank everybody for joining here tonight. Our next event's going to be on March 15th, I believe, with Brent Tarter, who wrote the book Grandees of Government, which is all about how undemocratic the Virginia political system has been since its inception. So we'll encourage folks to check that one out. We'll share links and graphics for that. But yeah, if anybody has any comments, reviews, anything they want to contribute to the Virginia Worker, you can reach out to us at contact@thevirginiaworker.com. Be sure to get Joe's new book, Class Struggle Unionism. And thanks again for everybody making the time and joining us. Thank you again, Joe.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Thanks for organizing.
Yep. Have a good one.